Hey, welcome back everyone. We're here once again in Camp La Mirada, here this time to show you what I think is the most important exercise. And before we get started, it's not the squat, it's not the deadlift, it's not a bent over row, a snatch nor a clean. It's none of these exercises. In my opinion, the most important exercise is the hip hinge. And the reason why the hip hinge is the most important is because without the hip hinge, guys, we won't be able to do all these lifts that I just talked about. Okay, so now before we get going with the exercises, let's see how a hip hinge is performed and what it generally is. We begin the hip hinge with our legs about shoulder width apart. We begin the hip hinge with the flexion at the hip joint, and we begin to descend. Meanwhile, as we're descending, as we're falling, we're making sure that our back stays in a neutral position. We often refer to it as a neutral spine. Okay, we come back up to the top and we extend hips. Once more, we begin by sticking out our butt. You can see it that way. By flexing at the hips, we descend, keep a neutral spine, and extend. Okay, so now, let's start off with the squat. I'm going to perform the squat as it's normally performed, and then I'm going to purposely perform the squat in a wrong way so that you can see what I mean about not being able to hip hinge, what kind of problems we get into. Okay, so now let's see how a squat would look like without the hip hinge, and let's see how drastically it changes. Okay, so now we often see this mistake. We often see this mistake with people that don't know how to hip hinge. See, because in their head, they're thinking that a squat is just a bend of the knees. Okay, but in reality, we saw that a squat is performed, right, by hinging at the hips first, and then falling into the hole. So there's no way we're going to be able to fall into the hole if we don't know how to hip hinge. This is going to end up happening. Our knees will go way past our feet, right, and we'll get ourselves into problems. Okay, so now let's see what would happen with the deadlift. Let's start the deadlift off in the conventional way, just so that we don't complicate things. Okay, so as I set myself up in front of my bar, I begin to drop the hips, stick my butt out, and begin to bend. Alright, so at this point, we see that it's practically a hip hinge. Okay, so the hip hinge is extremely involved here with the deadlift. Okay, so now as we make contact on our bar, we begin to pull, and we extend. Now, let's see how a deadlift would look without the hip hinge. And we commonly see this happen again. It's for the same reason as the squat. When we don't know how to work the hips, when we don't know how to hinge the hips, okay, we get ourselves into this problem. Our lower back starts to pay the price when it comes to the deadlift. And we know that the deadlift is extremely risky when it's not performed in its optimal way. And we know that, even something as light as 45 pounds on each side can still affect the lower back. Okay, so now imagine we had even more weight on the bar. Okay, now we get ourselves into real problems. Let's see how that would look with a row now. Now, a row is not a lower body exercise, but just so you see how important the hip hinge is, it's even involved in some of the best upper body exercises, such as the row. Begin with the hip hinge. Begin to roll. Down. Now let's see what a row looks like without the hip hinge. And again, we commonly see this happen. Okay, now it's for the same reason as these three other exercises. Once again, when we don't know how to work the hips, we get ourselves into these problems, guys. So it's one thing pointing out the mistakes, another offering solutions. Okay, so now there are two solutions that I like sharing with those that are unable to work the hips. Usually these two exercises are good enough to get you started and give you a good idea on what it is to isolate the hips. Okay, I'm going to use the rack. You can use any solid structure, anything that can hold its place, okay, for these two drills that I'm about to do. Okay, so the first of the two, is gonna be an exercise to learn how to isolate the hips. Okay, so I'm gonna stand in front of my solid structure, in this case the rack, about a foot away from it, maybe a bit less. Now I'm gonna push my butt back like I did for the hip hinge. Now I'm gonna make sure that my butt makes contact on the rack, on my solid structure, and I'm gonna start descending. I'm gonna come back up and extend my hips. Once again, I'm gonna push my butt back, and once my butt makes contact on the rack, I'm gonna keep it there, and I'm gonna start descending. The reason why I recommend doing this drill is because if we don't stick the butt out, we begin to have problems. Let's see what happens if I don't get my butt on the rack. Let's see how I look. And we commonly see this again. See, so my butt didn't hit the rack in this case, so I wasn't hip hinging. Okay, so once again, we stick our butt out, we make sure that our butt makes contact on the rack, and we know that we are working the hips this way. Our second option that we can do involves a resistant band. Okay, so what I'm gonna do with the resistant band is put it in between my legs. I'm gonna stand about a foot or two away from the rack, just so that the band offers me some resistance. I'm gonna fall back into that hip hinge again, and I'm gonna extend. Now the reason here that we're using the band is just so that it creates resistance, and I'm feeling what I'm supposed to be feeling. A stretch on the posterior chain, a stretch on the backside, my hamstrings, my butt, and my lower back. And pull. So now these two exercises, they are, in my opinion, enough to start getting used to how to work the hips. All right, so now, you may argue that you don't need the hip hinge to make progress in the gym, and that's correct. Okay, there are many ways to make progress in the gym. You can use machines, you can do all sorts of things that don't involve the hip hinge. But guys, there's a reason why, okay, the squat, the deadlift, the bent over row, okay, have existed for such a long time. Because these three exercises, okay, without going too far, these three exercises are enough to build strength and to make gains in the gym. They've existed for such a long time for that reason, guys. Okay, so we'll never see these exercises disappear because they offer the most bang for our buck, as we tend to say. So there you have it. This is why I think the hip hinge is most important, okay, because you saw that without the hip hinge, we got ourselves into a lot of problems, especially with these three lifts. Okay, so now, especially for beginners, okay, I always recommend that you don't encounter these exercises, you don't perform them without having to properly know how to use the hips, because we get ourselves into a lot of trouble. Okay, the squat, the deadlift, the bench over row, a lot of things are happening at the same time. It's not just one movement occurring like many people think. Okay, so and those exercises, those compound exercises that we caught, are the riskiest ones because they tend to be the ones that we lift heaviest with. So now if we don't have the proper form and we're lifting heavy, we're definitely gonna see problems. And that's gonna cause even more problems in the long run and stunt your growth as far as the gym goes. Okay, so well, hopefully this was a good, hopefully this was useful to you. And if it was, please share it, like, comment, leave your thoughts. Okay, and we'll see you guys next time. As always, thank you for joining us.